Hello, everybody. Flowtrace still deafened. I'll say hi to him in just a minute. Today, what we're going to be doing is reviewing a podcast. This is one that I just found on YouTube, and the guest is JJ McCullough, whose videos we have reviewed. We've reviewed one other video of his. Flowtrace is a big fan of JJ McCullough, and yeah, hi Flowtrace. Okay. Oh yeah, never mind. I can hear you a little bit now.
There we go. Yep. Sorry. I just always scramble to get everything working.
That's okay. Yeah, so this is a podcast that I just stumbled across on YouTube, and it caught my eye because the guest was JJ McCullough, who I know you're a fan of, and we reviewed one of his other videos before, and we liked it. And he's apparently a guest on this guy's podcast. I think the guy's like an anarchist philosopher YouTuber. And I don't really know what else to say about it than that.
Come on, JJ. What are you doing?
Well, we're gonna find out.
Yeah, let me just get this pulled up.
I got garbage trucks driving by me. Hopefully that's not obnoxious.
No, I'm not able to hear it at all, so I think you're good.
Okay.
Oh, and then hold on. I can even get it working with my... I go to... Man, why is this always such a pain to do? I don't know why, but it is.
Oh, there you are.
There we go. Let's go. There we go. Nice and painless. Let's see if this is working. It is. Oh, W.
I can't hear it almost at all though. It's very quiet.
McCullough. Some of you
How's that?
know
That's good,
of
thank
his
you.
work, but if not, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm JJ McCullough. I am a YouTuber, and I am also a columnist at the Washington Post, and I guess in both of my capacities, I spend a lot of time talking about Canadian things, cultural things, and sort of broadly, I guess, political things, although I like to say that I'm not a political YouTuber, although I am a political columnist.
Okay, so maybe just before we get into some of the deeper topics, I'm kind of wondering how you got into journalism, because I do have a fair amount of comments from people that they have some interest in journalism.
Yeah, so I guess my career in journalism just kind of mirrors the sort of growth of the internet in some ways, because like I'm older, I'm 38, and so when I first kind of came of age, I started blogging, and like that was a big thing. Like in the early 2000s, that's what you sort of did. That was sort of the bold new frontier. And then through my blogging, I sort of got picked up to write for more established publications. And then through my writing, I started doing, I got invited to go on television shows and do sort of on-air political commentary on TV. And that's what I did for many years. And then it was sort of through that I in turn sort of transitioned into YouTube when the television station I was working for ultimately shut down. But, you know, to sort of answer the question, I've been very fortunate in the sense that I've just always been producing work or content, even when people were not paying for it. And just based on, I guess, the quality of my content, I sort of got job offers. Like, I've been very fortunate in journalism that I've never really had to apply for any of the jobs I've had at any of the publications. I've always just been contacted by editors who are like, hey, we like your stuff, want to
That's awesome.
here,
Jesus.
want to go on our show, want to, you know, do this or that. And so the advice
That's
that I give
nice.
to sort of young people is that I do think that you should spend the most time sort of trying to hone your craft when you're young. Just get good at producing the kind of content that you think should exist in the world, even if no one is paying you to do that. You know, start practicing writing, write the kind of articles you want to write professionally. Just do it in an amateur capacity. If you want to be on television or on the radio or whatever, be a professional podcaster, just start making these things, even if no one's paying you to do it. Because ultimately, I do think we're living in a very sort of meritocratic era that is very hyper competitive, but the competition is fundamentally based on the quality of work that a writer can produce, and frankly as well, like the size of the pre-existing audience that they already have. So if you can become a successful amateur podcaster or even a successful amateur YouTuber, that becomes very attractive to a lot of editors who want to know not only that you can produce the kind of quality content in a consistent way, but that you have some sort of pre-existing audience that will consume it.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. In terms of the now getting into more like a little bit deeper of a question, but still related to journalism, I'm kind of wondering what sort of you think is the kind of utility of journalism in society, and how, due to like what you're calling it, this kind of like meritocracy that's emerged compared to like the more traditional forms of like going to school or maybe certain connections people have in order to enter into journalism, how this might be a good thing for journalism, and maybe why it might be a bad thing in terms of what you think journalism means to society.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a good sort of open-ended question, and it's interesting to me because like there's different ways you can interpret sort of what journalism is. So like I've worked mostly in opinion journalism. I have worked as a reporter and done some sort of the more sort of traditional hard news, quote unquote, sort of side of things. But I've spent most of my professional career in opinion journalism, which in some ways is the area of journalism that seems to be the most on the grow, but is also like the most controversial and the most frequently sort of scorned and criticized. And, I've sort of had to ask myself kind of existential questions about what the worth of that sort of journalism is. Like as I said before, like I don't consider my YouTube channel, for instance, to be political. And that's because having done a lot of political journalism on television, radio, and in print, I kind of grew to dislike it on some level. Like I grew to sort of feel like that there was just too much of that existing out there in the ether. And it wasn't actually a useful form of journalism on some level. Like just the sharing of opinions is not really what we need in this day and age. I think it has a place in journalism. I think that, good opinion writing is an art and a craft. And there's certainly like lots of great journalistic essayists and opinion writers who I admire greatly and think that they've sort of risen to the level of literature in terms of what they produce. I think of people like Heinrich Hertzberg at the New Yorker, one of my great sort of journalistic heroes. He's a fantastic essayist. I like George Will at the Washington Post. He's a great writer and an opinion writer. But, on the other hand, I do think that there is a bit of a crisis of knowledge, a crisis of access to information, of impartial information, of factual information. And I do think that is what journalism's primary function should be. It should be about communicating, certain facts and detailed information about the world around us in an impartial, objective way in order to help improve, what we sometimes call sort of the cultural literacy of the
I think I have to dispute what he's saying. Like, only like halfway though, right? Because I think there is some set of facts about the world that people probably should know, and that they're realistically only going to get through journalism. So like I'm on board with...
Yeah, the words are so loaded. Drawing that line is really hard.
Yeah. Once you start saying things like impartial and objective into there, it's like... I don't know, red flags start going up for me.
Yeah,
because it's like, okay, I get that he's talking about this outside of the context of the opinion journalism that he's doing. He's just talking about reporting, right? And I get that the ideal of reporting is that it's objective and impartial. In practice, it never is, because everything that they report gets filtered through the opinions of all the people that are doing it. And just the mere fact that there's an editorial process, and the fact that they have to choose which stories to cover and which stories not to cover, like that in itself is sufficient to mean that it can never be impartial and objective.
Yeah, and I think it's also the trouble is that even when we talk about impartial versus objective, it's like a spectrum, right? Like nothing is truly impartial, but but it is important to still be able to draw distinctions, which then makes it even harder to draw those distinctions because it is a spectrum, and so people are going to disagree about where you should draw that line. Actually, this kind of reminds me of I don't know if you followed all the Twitter spat recently over like Twitter giving, I think it was NPR and then the Canadian National Broadcasting, basically at Canada's BBC, they gave them like state-affiliated media tags, and there was this whole big controversy over whether or not they should have done that.
Oh, what's the story with that? I didn't follow it at all.
Yeah, basically NPR got given the state-affiliated media tag, which a lot of people objected to because NPR doesn't have, my understanding is they don't have any direction from the government, even though they are funded, and partially by the government. And what was really interesting was places like Al Jazeera, which did not have the state-funded media tag.
Oh, that's a little weird.
Yeah, even though they're way, way worse. And so there was a back and forth, oh, well, they are state affiliated, yeah, but is it really appropriate to call them that in context, especially when, a lot of other places aren't. And when you talk about public funding and stuff like that, I mean, even places like Fox News and CNN get a lot of that stuff too by virtue of sort of the way the American broadcasting landscape is.
Yeah, by the way, Al Jazeera, not necessarily a bad news source, but I think what you meant when you said worse, it's like that they are just very clearly,
Oh, yeah. They're just because Al Jazeera reports on it doesn't mean it's not right, but they are literally like a wing of the Qatari government.
Yeah.
But the other thing that's really interesting when he talks about sort of a crisis of knowledge, I wonder if he's going to get into is, I don't know if you're familiar, JJ really hates Wikipedia. He thinks it's awful.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No.
It's not the best take.
That's a very old man take, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's he's not a fan of it for a number of reasons that have moderate, I think, degrees of quality in terms of the arguments. But basically, I guess like a steelman argument I would give for his position. I don't really agree with it, but be something along the lines of Wikipedia has this problem of being of sort of being the singularity where everyone's getting all their information from Wikipedia, which makes it really prone to like single points of failure. And also people engage with it in a lazy way where they never then engage past the surface of Wikipedia, and that becomes like the only source of information. But it's like, okay, that's still better than like, the alternative. Like it's not a very good argument.
Yeah,
but I'm curious if we'll get into it.
The second part especially doesn't strike me as a very good argument. Like, it seems like it's probably true that a lot of times people will just, glaze over something on Wikipedia just at surface level and never look past it to, never learn it in more depth and never go to the primary sources. I'm sure that they do that all the time, but people did that before there was Wikipedia. They would just grab the encyclopedia, look up the thing, and read a couple of lines.
Encyclopedia, that's a best case scenario. Far more often, it would be like what, Pappy told me, on oh God, what's his name what Pappy told me on Lee Jackson Day. Like, that became like emboldened into your mind. Or I shouldn't be so derisive, but the point is, whatever source you would find, often whatever source you would find, you would emblazon into your mind, and very often this source would be of an average quality that is lower than Wikipedia. So even though, anyways. But I hope they get into that in this, because I really don't like that take from JJ at all.
Okay. What did you make of his take that we're living in a meritocratic society? Because that one raised a red flag for me too.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when you're trying to talk about like our society, like these kind of statements start to become meaningless. Like, we live in a meritocratic society. Like, point to it. It's like, well, our society is really big. It has a lot of differences, so it's kind of hard. But like, it's definitely more meritocratic than like it has been in the past, I'd say. Like, we're definitely, I think like the internet, like getting rid of, particularly in the realm of like content creation stuff, getting rid of middlemen, like the death of publishers and stuff like that. That does seem like a pretty big step. But whether or not you could call it a meritocracy, I don't know. That seems like very difficult to like concretely say. Yes, we are in the age of meritocracy now.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. That if when you remove a lot of the gatekeeping that of the kind that used to be present in traditional media, that you do end up with some opportunities for people who would never have succeeded under the old system, and in that sense, it's meritocratic. It's just like now people succeed by criteria that like. It's like very debatable whether you want to call it merit, right? I mean, obviously,
Yeah, that's fair.
people have. I mean, they succeed because there's a certain audience that they can appeal to, and in a sense that is merit, right? But I don't know. Like if that's really what he means is like the mere ability to like stir up popularity is counts as merit, then therefore we live in a meritocratic society because like TikTok influencers are able to get a lot of attention. Or I don't know.
I sort of buy that. I think the other really interesting thing on the question of meritocracy, especially with content creation, is the algorithm, because it seems like it's really hard for like when you blow up in the algorithm. Okay, was that because your content was really good, or because of like dark algorithms things that we don't understand? That's
Right.
I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, there's probably like a minimum threshold, right? Like the algorithm is not blowing up someone who uploads, like 720p, like them talking into their microphone like this for like 30 seconds, but among the people that do blow up, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that have good content that doesn't get blown up. So it'd be, I think that's another interesting question of like how, right? I mean, it's sort of just a classic, opportunity is luck plus preparation, right? Trying to sort that out in the algorithm just sort of adds a new complexity to it, where it's like, did I finally get my break, or was the algorithm just being kind to me? That's a really interesting thing to think about.
And usually, when people say meritocracy, usually what they're implying, although JJ didn't say this, usually people mean that we all start out with equal opportunity or approximately equal opportunity, and then you just rise to the top based on the quality of your work or not. And
Really? I didn't even know that was implied in meritocracy. That way.
I don't think it's explicitly like part of the definition of it. It's just like my experience of talking to people who talk about meritocracy. It's like it just seems to be that's the way that they conceive of it. Is that the way you rise to the top? It is due to the quality of your work and nothing else, right? And or at least that's like extremely important to whether you succeed or not, right? And I think that the implication there is that two people who do work of equal quality are going to have equal success. But in real life, of course, we know that that's not true. Like people just don't actually have equal opportunity. Like not everyone is. I don't know. Like for lots of different reasons that Um, and I guess what I'm trying to say is like if person A succeeds over person B for a reason other than the merit of their work, then I think that kind of conflicts with the narrative of meritocracy.
Public, to bring the public up to speed with what they, quote unquote, need to know in order to function in their society, to function as citizens of a democracy. That kind of communication of useful, practical, important information about the world around you, I think, is the primary function of journalism. But I worry that nowadays we are drifting because of the explosion of opinion journalism, which there seems to be more market demand for, that we're now kind of getting into the space where the only sort of journalism that people want to consume is not journalism that exists for communication, but journalism that exists for like in what we could generally or generously call like analysis, like that all communication of information has to come with it a sort of prism for what you should think, what your conclusion should be, right? And this then starts to blur all sorts of lines between objectivity and bias and, agendas and even sort of like, falsehood or selective telling of information for the purposes of helping one sort of political philosophy or agenda over another. So
why do you think that there's more of a market demand now for kind of like having an ideological framing for certain types of analysis or more opinion journalism? I'm thinking of like people my age are probably less likely to go out looking at like the BBC or for like news. They're going to go on Reddit or Instagram or YouTube to kind of get these sort of like half analytical, half opinion-based nuggets of information about the society they live in, like the larger world. Why do you think that there's like such an impulse right now for that and such a demand for that? Why it's exploding compared to traditional media that's supposed to be more objective?
Well, I mean, I think it's more entertaining. Like, I think that there can be no denying that. Like, we live in a sort of golden age of commentary, of entertainment commentary, you could say. Like, you watch these YouTube videos and they're fun to watch. They're very compelling. You know, they have fun visuals. They have charismatic hosts, and you know, same is true of streamers or people that write, you know, just kind of polemical articles. Like, it's fun to consume. I think that there also is I think that the sort of the crisis of knowledge in our modern society also begets a kind of desire for shortcuts to knowledge. And I think that a lot of opinion journalism and, you know, opinion commentary more broadly kind of, it registers as a kind of pseudo knowledge or a shortcut to knowledge, or like quick, easy knowledge that helps you sort of like progress through the steps. So it's like you're not only getting the information, you're also being told what to think about that information. And you're also sort of being given a conclusion of what that information means and how you should use that information, you know, which in the way that a lot of commentary information is communicated, you know, it reinforces some larger thesis about the way the world is, you know, like it is the left is out to get you or the right is out to get you, you know, like information that we're communicating only exists to kind of reinforce.
Can we pause again?
A sort of larger sort of.
I just wanted to elaborate in a different way on the point that he's making. Like why would it be the case that opinion journalism could serve as like a substitute for just information-based reporting? I think the idea is that people aren't interested in information about the world just for its own sake. They're interested in it because it's going to serve some social purpose, like knowing that information, and that's either going to be that it's going to facilitate their participation in politics, or it's going to give them something to talk about with their friends, or it's just going to give them the feeling of being knowledgeable about the world. And the thing is, like, opinion-based journalism can serve all of those purposes in a way that's going to reduce your need to feel like you need to fill that niche.
Yeah, I think that what this is sort of hovering on the periphery of, or I should say hovering on the periphery to imply that this is like secondary to it, but it's highly related to this thing that happens where the ideas become very integrated with your identity. And it's like a really bad thing, because your ideas should arguably change a lot more than your identity are, because you can be really wrong about ideas. But when those start to become, you know, very interwoven, it's very hard to change, right? And it feels like, you know, when someone attacks your ideas, they're attacking who you are. This is a very difficult thing. And I don't know, what I want to say is, it feels like this is getting a lot worse, but it is one of those things that's just that, you know, if you go back and you read history, I mean, there are people, you know, it's hard to imagine that, you know, things are worse now than they were in like the 70s, you know, and like when Vietnam was happening and, you know, the country was losing its mind. But man, it really does feel like social media adds a new edge to this kind of stuff, where it is just so omnipresent all the time.
I think gosh, I have actually a lot of thoughts about all this stuff you just said. Okay, so I think social media adds an edge to it in the sense that now the ideas that are forming part of our identity are ideas that are in opposition to people who are adjacent to us. Where that wouldn't have necessarily been true in earlier times. I think it's actually pretty normal for people's ideas to form a big part of their identity. I think that's kind of what culture is, right? You grow up like just absorbing the ideas of your family and your community, and like that's just like basically everybody does that. But then when you have ideas that are kind of part of this like conflict zeitgeist, and then those
it's like a specific genre of ideas that are taking up a bigger piece of the pie, whereas previously it would have been like, you know, I'm a conservative, I'm a liberal, that's, you know, maybe like 20%. Now it feels like it's like 50 or 60%. It's like, ugh.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like people I don't even know if it's a larger share of people. It might be a larger share of people, but it seems like people are more militant about it in any case. Or that conflict is taking up more like mind space per
Yeah,
person.
I think this is actually something that is it's like the key distinction is it feels like they're probably actually really. I don't know how true it is that there's more people fighting about this, but the people that are fighting about it are like on front stage. Like we've got 24 hours like video feed of this. So
Right.
it becomes like the thing that everyone talks about, even if it's only still like 2% of the population are the ones that are really going crazy. Those 2% of the population, I feel like, are now like on the front stage, and they're constantly like the focus of societal and cultural like conversation.
Right. So then, there's like the Spider-Man quote that everybody quotes all the time, though, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And there's this kind of like, there's this observation that people make about like democracy sometimes, that when you distribute power among more people feel responsible for the system, and therefore more people feel invested in the outcomes, and therefore they're more likely to kind of like take up the sides in a conflict or something. And I sort of feel like social media is doing that kind of thing, right? It's like now we've distributed not just the power of direct political participation, but also the power of like political journalism and alternative media. And I mean, it's just a much more balkanized like media system, and much more broadly distributed within each niche as well. I mean, here we are streaming to like single digit numbers of people or whatever at the time, right? Which is something that never would have happened a couple decades ago, and just the fact that so many more people can participate in the game probably makes more people feel invested in that game of like.
Yeah, I think I think the fact that you can select so much doesn't the selection the selection process, the fact that you can select for your own echo chamber isn't just bad because you're in an echo chamber, but it makes you more invested in that echo chamber in the first place, right? Like when you choose to be, if we had a scenario where you end up in the same echo chamber, it's the exact same, but in one scenario you're consciously choosing. I feel like in that scenario versus the one you just happen to end up in there, you're gonna have a much different relationship with it.
Right, because like some part of your mind wants to like justify the choice, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Structural narrative about the world around us, which if you lack knowledge, I think that can be very attractive, because it's like, okay, now I have a very kind of clear-cut foundation for understanding everything. I don't have to go through the long arduous process of reaching my own conclusions or kind of coming sort of realizing what the purpose of the information I'm consuming is for. You're just kind of given this sort of prepackaged easy worldview, and opinion journalism exists increasingly just to sort of prop up one of these two great sort of polarized tribes that define our modern reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess speaking of polarization, we could also talk about what nationalism means, because I think going back to kind of talking about how there's maybe how it looks like there's a multiple different types of truth kind of circling around in opinion pieces online, it's hard for somebody to really navigate kind of what's going on in their nation or their country, what they should support for their nation or their country. It's very difficult to, I think, figure out exactly like what you should support sometimes. And I think there's also a lot of criticism of nationalism itself and seeing it as kind of a kind of fundamentalist doctrine of you shouldn't be like overly occupied with nationalism to begin with. So I'm kind of wondering, like, first of all, if you're somebody who cares a lot about like their nation or their country, how to navigate like the media like this, and then secondly, if someone's identity should be so tied to the idea of the nation state.
Yeah, so like these are sort of questions that I spend a lot of time thinking about, because like a lot of the content that I make, especially on YouTube, but also I'd say in my writing, sort of tackles with questions of nationalism and national identity and what it means to be from one place and not another. And especially, you know, just because I'm Canadian and I live in Canada, a lot of these sort of questions I filter through the prism of what it means to be Canadian and how Canadians sort of conceptualize themselves. And, you know, a lot of the Canadian press, I do think, is quite sort of nationalistic. I have a lot of... I enjoy poking fun at some of the nationalistic hot takes that I think you often read in like the major newspapers in this country, particularly the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star. It really sort of reached a peak, I think, frankly, during COVID, in which there was, on the opinion page, but also to some degree in the hard news as well, there was just so many of these very tendentious stories that were about like Canada is doing so well in COVID because Canadians are such great people and we're so selfless and cooperative and deferential to authority and we just do everything right and that's why our COVID rates are so low, unlike the evil devil Americans next door who do everything wrong and are just terrible and their individualism is the source of their own, you know, misery and, you know, like there was just so much of this kind of stuff, right? And you know, what I wonder about this is that when you read the American press by contrast, and like the American press that's being written by the sort of the American equivalent of the sort of people that are writing these takes in Canada, the American press by contrast is so pessimistic and is so down on America. You read the New York Times, you read a elite magazine like The Atlantic, and it's just all crapping on the US. It's like, America's a failed state, we can't do anything right, this is the beginning of the end of our country, it's like post-American world and all of this kind of stuff. And so it's sort of like, the thing that sort of causes me to sort of take a step back is that as much as I really like don't like the kind of raw patriotic narratives that the Canadian press routinely pushes, I also feel like the American press and its like deep pessimism towards the American system and the American way is not great either. So it kind of makes me wonder, like, is there an appropriate kind of like middle ground that you can find here? Like, is it appropriate for the press to be, to some degree, defensive of the country, to some degree be kind of like put a positive spin as a...
So I'll pause here because I just want to say the answer is yes. I think JJ is right on the money with this. Man, this is one of those things where it's like, it feels like the answer isn't that complicated. Not that hard to be like, you know what? It's okay to be up on the country you're in, but still acknowledge that it is not perfect. It has shortcomings and that, you know what? It's good, but it could be a lot better. Let's not rest on our laurels. Our parents made this country better for us. Let's make the country better for our kids. Mm-hmm. But then, why can't we just think that? But instead, it's like, no, bro. Like, either it's like, it's just the most infuriating shit ever. Because instead of doing that, which isn't hard, it's not complex, not difficult, super self-explanatory, super straightforward. Instead, it just becomes this battle between like, don't you know that the air we're breathing actually belonged to the proto-human Neanderthals, and our entire race is built on genocide, and we genocided the Neanderthals, and we deserve death? And next to that person, you have another great option, an even better option right there, where it's like, oh yeah, my country's done nothing wrong ever. Slavery actually benefited the country, bro. It actually benefited the victims of slavery. Look at the condition of people in Africa versus the condition of people in America. They should be thankful for being slaves. It's like, holy shit, why are these the options? What happened? Why? This is so unnecessary, man. Oh my god, it's just so fucking stupid with that shit.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know how people are with their black and white thinking, so.
Yeah, I don't understand it. Yeah, I don't know. There are, I think, some interesting conversations about where do we draw those lines then, right? You know, like I think a great example is how people kind of view George Bush now. It's sort of like, oh, old George, ha ha ha. It's kind of funny. It's like, guys, I don't know if this is the right move considering, you know, what transpired during that administration. But like, we're not even remotely close to having an interesting conversation about like, how do you reconcile that kind of stuff? We're soft locked on the tutorial where it's like, learn how to simultaneously acknowledge that a country can be good and have done bad things. And we're like, dang, it's impossible. You can't do that. There's no way.
Well, let's do the same thing for Bush then, right? It's like he had some, disasters during his administration, like the Iraq War and the economic downturn. But also what he's largely remembered for now is doing like charity work that more than almost any other president has ever done.
Not being Trump. That's also what he's remembered for. Yeah.
But he's beloved in like a lot of the world. Like in sub-Saharan Africa, he did a bunch of like AIDS charity work that he's remembered for. So it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know. I hate the human race. We deserve death.
Well, we genocided the Neanderthals, So
true.
Opposed to just always a negative spin. Is there an advantage in some way to the way that Canadian patriotism seems much more robust, certainly at the elite level? Like the Canadian elite just seems much more patriotic than I think the American elite is, certainly in the realm of journalism. Mm-hmm. And even like, because like some people I'm sure will be hearing this and say like, well, what about Fox News and what about sort of like the right-wing American press? But even then, I think like a lot of the right-wing American press is just full of stories about how the country is going to hell in a handbasket, and every school is full of drag queen story hour, and old man Biden is setting the country on a road to ruin, and socialism and Marxism, like all this kind of stuff, right? So it's an interesting question to sort of like think, does the press have an obligation?
It's our future communist drag queen Sharia law.
Kind of carry water for the country on some level, or uplift the citizenry in some way, because like that is useful in a democratic context. Because like if you view the idea of like the press as being sort of like guardians of democracy in some way, you can't really have a functional democracy if the public is constantly encouraged to believe that their society is hopeless and without any redeeming qualities whatsoever. So
yeah, and it's also just this thing of like, man, people, there's such a perverse incentive, I feel like, to be negative, or not even to be negative, but to have certain emotions in the extreme that are detached, right? People talk about, righteous indignation is such a dangerous emotion because it makes you feel good, right, in a way that's like detached from reality, and that's true. But I feel like the same is also true for like doom scrolling or being super doomer. People are like, oh, we never stand. It's over. This is the end of the West. We've fallen. It's over. I mean, dude, going back to like the Trump stuff, dude, I remember, like people in like California were like, it's over. Oregon will never be the same now that Donald Trump is in. I was like, bro, like it's like I don't think Trump is good either. I think Trump's gonna be bad. Like, let's bring it back a moment here. Let's be a little more realistic. But people love like oh god, there's some term for this. It's like reveling in like melancholy or something like this. Like people just love like being awash in like this doomerism and stuff. Like romanticizing this like all these awful feelings. It almost kind of reminds me of like some of the ways like lost causers will talk about like the Civil War. Like, oh, our brave Southern boys never stood a chance against these Northern devils. We were doomed from the start. We were just a tragically, romantically doomed people. It's just like, yeah, this kind of stuff is just so infectious, and the desire, the reward for feeling that way is so strong that you just start to legitimately become lost in the sauce, like sniffing your own farts, thinking that actually no, it really is this bad. When it's like, bro, you're just saying this because it feels good. It's like the TikToks or like the Twitters or the Tumblrs of like very young girls very often being like, oh, I'm such a victim and I can't believe all these horrible things, or all the young adult novels that deal with like, oh, one brave person against the endless tide, all these sorts of things. Oh, and it's not good, y'all.
I think maybe what you're getting at is that there's an incentive in this like attention economy on social media. There's an incentive to have a dramatized version of everything you talk about because that's what gets more eyeballs on you, and that's what retains more eyeballs on you. And this kind of makes me want to tie that back to the point about meritocracy, right? Because it's like this: if you really believe that social media is meritocratic, then you have to believe that playing things up dramatically is part of what constitutes merit right? Because
Yeah.
if this is such a big part of like what helps people get attention and succeed on social media is just that they're so dramatic, and I suspect JJ would not want to call that merit.
Yeah, well, I think it's, in my opinion, I would call it merit in that context. I think it's the difference between people who like that. I really don't like moralizing of capitalism in either direction. I don't like people who are like, capitalism is evil. But then there's also these people on the right who are like, capitalism is so moral because the dignity of man and the sweat of your brow and money that's just the institutionalized civilizational representation of hard work, which is a virtue before God. It's like, bro, what are you talking about? It's just a good way to allocate stuff. That's it. It's not even the perfect way to allocate stuff. It's really flawed. It's all these things, but it's better than all the other ways. So that's how we allocate stuff, right? Merit in this context isn't like moral merit. It is merit of literally the market itself.
Merit of just successfully playing the game.
Yeah, exactly. It is, oh, well, what's your merit in social media? Getting views. Oh, well, it's social media. That's all that is to it. Like, you shouldn't get wrapped up in all these conceptions of like, oh, well, what is right and what is wrong? Like, it's just a system. It does things, and most of the time those things are good. Not always. No system's perfect. But on average, it seems to play out for us in a good way, right? When we have a social media system that lets people select for things they like, it tends to enhance their lives. And if we think that it isn't selecting for that enough, and in fact it might be actually outweighing, well then maybe we shouldn't do it. But it's not a matter of like, oh, well, that's not true merit. No, it is. It's just that the system itself is morally neutral, and it's the outcomes we care about.
If we're willing to point at whatever qualities it is that make people successful and just call those merit, then at that point it's just a tautology to say that the system is meritocratic, because like whatever it is, I don't know. Like,
yeah, well, I think the specific question in that usage of the word meritocracy is specifically whether or not we think that the system is selecting for the outcomes that it ought be. Like a great example would be like how back in the day, military officers, they didn't select those for people who were good. That was just like a thing they gave out to like nobles and rich people, and it was legitimately a huge like
it was like a reward for loyalty or something.
Yeah, and it literally and we think of, well, the merit of that system ought be military success, and it was a huge military development to be like, let's put people in charge that are good at their jobs. Or even in American civil service, this was the thing too. God, I'm not going to remember exactly what point of history this was, but there was some big change, I want to say in the 20th century, where American service sectors like mailmen, garbage men, and all the positions around them, this was just shit you just gave to people that you liked and stuff. It was not at all trying to select for merit or whether or not you did a good job. So there were just these huge areas of the country where it's just totally dysfunctional, like the basic services. But yeah, I think just the key then is, what do we mean when we say merit? Because we would think of these systems as aspiring towards a certain thing, like actually being effective in their instance, but other people wouldn't. We would say that then that's a dysfunctional system.
Yeah, so if there's such a big history of authority figures rewarding people for reasons other than being good at their job, like, mostly just who do they like, who do they get along with, who's loyal to them, it makes me think that like the people who are consuming social media are probably just doing approximately the same thing, right? They're not looking for some like, I don't know, standard measure of who's good at their job. They're just looking for who do they like, who do they feel comfortable with, and who's part of their like.
I just think in social media that the amalgamation of that does actually tend to select for merit in the context that we want it to be, in a way that isn't true. Like, because with social media, it is basically, well, what do you like? Whereas like choosing like a mailman, it's like, okay, who can deliver the mail, even if you don't like them very much.
Yeah, I guess it's just like, who do you like it can mean so many different things though, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an interesting balance, and like I said, it's something I've just been thinking a lot more about recently, particularly in the wake of COVID.
Well, because Canada, it's almost kind of like an uphill battle for journalists in Canada to kind of convey a sense of like a rah like patriotism to the same level of the States, and I think, and I know you said that like Canada is displaying that, but I think, at least in my opinion, the kind of American over pessimism is a response to the many years of over rah patriotism. Like, it seems like a lot of their narratives have either failed the population, or there's segments of the population that inherently disagree with kind of these like meta narratives in American history. I'm kind of wondering, because it seems like Canada is more built upon, we don't really have, and you talk about this a lot in your videos, we kind of struggle to maintain symbols and icons for Canadian history that people actually look at and they're like, these are beyond stereotypes. These are actual like patriotic things we can look at. And I think it was like Lucien Bouchard kind of regarding like unity, he talks about like Canada is not a real country in that sense. And it is almost like we're like fundamentally our identity is in the negative. It's our identity comes from a void. We're anti-American. We're not unified. We don't have these stories, and that's what makes us Canadian in a way. Like it's very difficult to I think get past that, to articulate that in journalism. But I'm wondering what you think.
No, I think that's a very good insight. I think that's very accurate. I think that Canadian patriotism versus American patriotism, like Canadian patriotism has always been defined in the negative, always, going back to the earliest days. It has always been based around anti-Americanism. Anti-Americanism is the fundamental raison d'etre of this country. I don't like that, but you have to be clear-eyed about the reality. You know, that this country was from its earliest days, it was founded to be a kind of un-America, and how that mandate has been understood has changed over time. Sometimes that's been interpreted from the right. You know, Canada's gone through phases where it's been a very reactionary country, and Canada is sort of now in a phase where it defines itself in a very progressive way. But it's always with an underlying sort of, the second half of the sentence is always like, unlike America. Whereas America has traditionally defined itself, I would say, in a more affirmative sort of sense of patriotism. America does not conceptualize itself as a rejection of some other country. It conceptualizes itself as a country that has inherent worth unto itself. You know, it has the great Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and a wonderful sort of democratic system of government, yada, 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 you know, American dream, equality of opportunity, and all of these kinds of things. The problem, though, is that if there becomes a turning point at which Americans decide that that's all a big load of BS, and that these ideas are not worth, you know, what they've claimed to be, as you sort of said in the past, like if the founding fathers were a bunch of, you know, slave-holding idiots who had like badly conceived ideas of democracy, and if America's actually fundamentally defined by, you know, great racial inequalities and economic exploitation and all sorts of these sort of terrible things, it's difficult to kind of recover from that, right? Whereas like in Canada, you can always be negative about your enemy, right? Like your enemy will always be there. You can always slur and slander your enemy.
Will your
right?
enemy always
that
be
will
there?
never go away. Regardless of how great America is or isn't, Canadians will always be able to come up with reasons to hate and fear America, because, you know, these are emotions that come easily to any people. Right. But the problem with America right now is that, like, if and perhaps these are correct conclusions, but like if Americans sort of traditional sources of patriotism, if the founding fathers, the founding documents, sort of like the broad sort of positive interpretation of American history, if that stuff is all false, then how do you recover from that? Basically what you would have to do, and there is some effort to try to do this, but like, can you create new American stories, new sort of things to look up to, new symbols, new sources of affirmative patriotism? It just seems like a much tougher battle. I think it's interesting to witness as somebody that's interested in how cultural symbols are created and perpetuated, but again, like these are sort of things that make me sort of like second guess you know, how nationalism works and what a viable nationalist strategy is. And I think that it probably wouldn't occur to some people to think that in some ways maybe the Canadian way is a little bit more stable.
Because we're kind of talking about the US, and I think Canadians kind of conceive the US as it's just like the extreme version of us. Like they're like everything we do is like somewhat milder in a sense. Like we have we are like somewhat more close with the Queen. We have like a welfare system that's a little bit more you know, compared to the US and their version to socialism, and our media is I would argue partially because it's like somewhat associated with the state, at least more so than in the US. It's a bit less like polarizing. It's a bit more kind of like it's a bit more boring, at
Yeah.
least like when you watch like the National or compared to Fox or CNN, which can be quite
Boring can be good.
intense. That it's almost like Canada has a bit of a less of rigidity. Like it's a bit more willing to just slightly make adjustments. Whereas the U.S., it's very like, for example, they've had an unchanged constitution for an insanely long time compared to other countries. They're
What? The Constitution has changed pretty radically, actually, if you really put it into context, with, people needing land to vote, and then women being able to vote, and black people being able to vote. I don't know if I would agree with that statement. And I mean, and yeah, I mean, even talk about application, like, bro, the Commerce Clause. That's a pretty big like change in how like the Constitution is effectively functions, and with the expansion of federal power.
Yeah, I don't think that what he said is literally true, but I think what he's getting at is that our Constitution has not been like redone from scratch in a really really long time,
Okay, I see what you mean.
250 years, which is longer than like most other foundational systems of governments around the world. Like France is on its like fifth or sixth republic or something. So
very because of their overt nationalism, their overt patriotism, they're very willing to maintain old historical narratives, even if it might be detrimental. And Canada, and I don't think Canada is entirely isolated in this, is a little bit more willing to kind of adapt or change a little bit. Although saying this makes it sound like it's a huge like a win for Canada, but I think that could also lead to kind of the unstable sense of nationalism and the negative nationalism we might experience as Canadians, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I'm trying to sort of like analyze this kind of stuff in a completely objective way, right? Mm-hmm. So, some respects, like when we have these kinds of conversations, I think the tendency is to ascribe a certain moral worth in one way of doing something or the other way. But if we're sort of like taking like a 10,000 foot view of this, if we're just trying to like analyze it as aliens, right? Like I think that there is a case to be made that the kind of negative nationalism in a sort of purely kind of like cynical way, might work better as a source of like unity and keeping the people together more than anything else, right?
I'm just now noticing the parallel between the way they're talking about Canada having this negative nationalism against the United States. I'm just now noticing the parallel to what people say about Ukraine, right? Like Vladimir Putin complains that Ukraine is this like anti-Russia or like a foil to Russia. I don't know. Do you think that like makes any sense as a parallel?
I can see the parallel. I think the trouble is that, like, it's probably... I think there's a lot of truth to what JJ's saying about how sort of Canada's always defined itself in contrast to America, whereas I feel like Ukraine hasn't really actually done that. That's also like an invention to justify the invasion.
Yeah, it's more recent. Well, what do you make of the idea that form of nationalism is going to be more stable? Because...
I mean, who fucking knows? This shit is like impossible to verify or falsify. And it's like there's a lot of other things that also matter, like country stability, like the economy, like immigration, like technological changes, warfare. You want to know a great reason why America and Canada are really stable? Because they are highly developed nations with big oceans around them that make it really difficult for people to roll up on us.
And relatively friendly to each other, at least since the mid-1800s.
Because we're so culturally similar, I think. I don't know. I think this kind of stuff is interesting to talk about, and there is value in it. But as soon as you start stepping into the realm of like prescriptions and predictions, I think you get onto very thin ice very quickly, because this kind of stuff is so hard to make anything definitive out of.
Yeah, I don't think I can like prove this for sure, but when I think about like the most long-lasting like cultures and civilizations in the world, it does not seem like they are ones that define themselves in opposition to somebody else. I mean, China has been sitting around for how many thousands of years, and like it's they're not an anti anybody else really.
Yeah, and the other thing is I feel like so much of this also is happening with so much of this is happening inside of the context that it is trying to defeat and can't escape. The social media, I think the social media effect upon our sort of psyche and like our collective consciousness that leads to, people having all these crazy ideas about like, we need to go back to tradition, or just take whatever you want, whatever crazy ideology you want that is springing up online now. Even trying to find solutions to those things still happen within the context of being on social media and being just a little bit crazy because of it. And I really do wonder if like this is like if in 10 years, we'll look back on these statements and realize like, oh yeah, this person was what being online and on Twitter does to an MF, in the same way that we can currently recognize that about someone who's like, my name's Justin, I'm 13 and I'm a cab.
I feel like the fact that this conversation has to take place on social media is just kind of an acknowledgement of the fact that the technology is here to stay, and we're not really able to get rid of it. And in order to kind of solve and or mitigate the problems that come from it, like what we have to do is like either improve on it or move on to the next thing as best we can, rather than try to revert to a pre-social media world, which is just never gonna happen.
You do have to take a step forward, but I think it is, but there's like when people are talking like, oh, what form of nationalism is the best for long-term stability, like I am having some distant alarm bells and red flags go off to a lesser degree, but in the same vein as someone who's like, oh, Russia, World War II, Russia versus Nazi Germany. Let me tell you, I played a lot of Hearts of Iron, and here's what I would have done. Like, it still feels like, okay, guys, like, I feel like we're a little, but in like the less social media armchair analysis of this kind of stuff that is like, that is like fundamentally flawed and like not a good way of like analyzing or getting correct prescriptions or descriptions of the world.
I'm tempted to almost say that I trust the Hearts of Iron person more, because they're at least like not just coming up with the idea out of like literally nowhere. They're coming up with it from a predefined simulation, and of course people can like look at the simulation, go, it's a game, of course it's not going to be perfectly realistic, and I feel like that makes it better because of how obviously fictional it is, right? I think the Hoi 4 player is more likely to have a more realistic assessment of the value of their like the conclusions that they draw from it.
Yeah, but I don't know. But at the same time, I do think there are some real kernels, and not even just kernels. I mean, I do think they're coming from very solid ground, which is that you need to have that there is a healthy version of nationalism that is a balance of, having something positive to aspire to and take pride in, while also, not blindly following it and being open to criticism and improvement. It's just so hard to try and, I think, take this kind of stuff is just so hard to like truly ever take a step back and get a bird's eye view, because you're just so inherently entrenched in it. Like it's impossible to ever truly have a detached view.
I sort of think what they're trying to point out with what's going on in the United States, like we have it seems like a lot of the political turmoil that we have here has a lot to do with the fact that we have these lofty ideals that we can never actually live up to, right? And it just seems like we're, agonizing over our failure to have those ideals in the first place, whereas countries that have like a more realistic vision of like a more achievable set of ideals might not be like racking themselves with guilt over their failure to achieve them.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like the Dunning-Kruger thing, right? Where like, on the one hand, I feel like, oh, we're right here. We probably have, better reasons for our answers than, the people that are talking about like, we need to, stan Andrew Jackson and stuff like this. Like, I feel like we're on better footing than them. But then it's like, oh, but are we really? Maybe we should be even more self-critical of ourselves. Should we hold ourselves to a higher standard? And then it's like, okay, but at a certain point, if you keep running down this, if only one side is constantly questioning themselves to the point point where they're actually like handicapping themselves, that's going to be the side whose ideas don't win as much. So it feels like it's so hard to strike the exact like balance and fusion of like self-criticism and self-reflection, but also being like, okay, my ideas aren't perfect, but I'm still going to promote them pretty strongly here. I'm not just going to constantly go, well, I'm not sure, I don't know, because like otherwise the people who definitely don't know are going to be out there being like, oh, I know what the answer is.
My intuition is to kind of like extrapolate from the role that that ideals play in our personal lives and try to like compare that to having nationalistic ideals, just because I mean the way I think about it in terms of our personal lives is it's good to have achievable goals. It's also good to have like some, you know, like I think a mix of more and less attainable ideals, you know, like if you're meeting all your ideals, then I think like you're probably not thinking big enough in terms of, you know, like, because I think the point of your ideals is to give you a direction to move to try to improve on things, right? And so it makes some amount of sense to have them be like out of reach, so as to give you something to strive for, so as not to like stagnate, right? And then there's just like a balance to strike between like having being idealistic enough to have something to move towards, but not so idealistic that you feel like hopelessly out of touch with reality or something. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? Just because, like, again, like, just underlying everything that Canada does or doesn't do, or does and doesn't say about themselves, is always underwritten by the anti-Americanism, right? So, like, everything is always compare and contrast with the US, and so things never have to be particularly good in Canada. They just have to be better than some mythical American alternative, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the classic example would be, like, say, the Canadian healthcare system, which is not ranked very high internationally. We are not seen as being a particularly competent country when it comes to administering healthcare services in any sort of timely or even affordable manner. But because, rightly or wrongly, we perceive ourselves as at least doing it better than the US does, that's enough, right? Mm-hmm. That's enough to sort of provide a great deal of, happiness and patriotic pride to Canadians, right? When you do a survey and you say, what makes you proudest to be Canadians put like the healthcare system funny. Above even the flag or the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And that is only comprehensible in the context of this kind of negative sense of self, right? But again, like you could say, like maybe that works in a weird sort of twisted way. Like maybe that's all nationalism really requires. And maybe if you do, again, like what America does, and you try to have a more affirmative sort of sense of nationalism based on, a pantheon of heroes and a sort of heroic telling of your history and what the country exists to do in an affirmative sense, maybe that only lasts as long as there's kind of like a broad elite consensus that all of these things matter. And I think that, that is difficult to sustain in a democratic society, right? Because a diverse democratic society especially brings a lot of voices, a lot of different perspectives, and then inevitably I think some of these things become contested because, if you sort of say, well, the founding fathers were great, and then other people will say, well, great for whom? And, whereas Canada doesn't have to rely as heavily on that kind of stuff. Like if you tear down John A. Macdonald, the first prime minister, which is sort of fashionable to do right now, if you tear down all of his statues and take his name off all the buildings, I think a lot of Canadians just kind of shrug their shoulders and they don't really care because they haven't really taught to venerate him in the same way that Americans have been taught to venerate George Washington. There's been efforts to try to build him up as a sort of George Washington-esque figure, but my argument would be that it's not out of some sort of inherent modesty that we haven't venerated our founders in the same way. It's just that those kinds of things are just less necessary for the type of patriotism Canada has traditionally practiced, which has been an anti-American patriotism.
Yeah, no, that's quite, and I think a pretty apt kind of discourse on how Canada just is perhaps sometimes over-reliant on the anti-American narrative. And also, what I'm finding interesting is, like, we're talking about nationalism in terms of how it tends to harken back the past and, like, historic symbols, whether they're true or not. And this is traditionally what happens with nationalism. But you did mention like kind of what if the U.S. was able to develop kind of new values or new kind of national symbols. And I'm wondering if you think that is feasible, because nationalism, especially at its most extreme, when you start to see kind of fascism and stuff like that, where they're kind of just developing kind of not entirely real and sometimes entirely fictional accounts of history to justify present actions that could be, quite violent. Do you think that there's like a viable form of nationalism that is more looking towards the future instead of like the past?
I might even say looking towards the present.
Yeah, or the present. Yeah.
And this is something that like I actually do care about a lot. Like if I'm going to become sort of like less objective for a moment now, right?
Yeah, that's good.
I definitely think that this crisis of American identity is one of sort of like the defining crises of our time. I think it is very important for the Western world that America remain a strong and resilient and self-confident nation. I think all of us sort of under the American umbrella and in the American alliance have a vested interest in that being the case. I think we want the American civilizational model to succeed, in contrast to the Chinese model or the Russian model or any other sort of more authoritarian, illiberal model. I think we should all feel a stake in American success. And I think that in turn means that Americans need to feel pride and happy and satisfied with their country and believe that they're doing the right thing. And so one thing that I kind of do in my small way, and this is not just for the purposes of boosting American egos, I think this is also part of Canadian cultural literacy, because I do believe that fundamentally, independent of how we conceptualize ourselves patriotically, I do view us as an extension of a larger American civilization and a larger American culture that is worth being literate in. But anyway, that's a long way of saying that I make a lot of videos where I talk about sort of like American culture and the American cultural canon and all of the many different things that America has contributed to the world, and certainly to its own culture in terms of innovations in food and entertainment and household objects and just sort of styles of life, a kind of middle class life and a middle class identity that is very distinctly American, and all of sort of the associated objects and traditions and things that are associated with that. Because I do think that like if those of us in the American civilization, in the American culture, can develop a more deeper appreciation for just the way that our way of life is distinct and special and historically unprecedented and remarkable in many ways, like I do think that can become a source of pride that is maybe a little bit less politicized, less bound up in potentially problematic or divisive historical figures or events and so forth. So I sometimes use the phrase like that it's culturalism more than nationalism, right? It's about forming an identity that's pardon me, fundamentally based on a cultural identity and an appreciation for a culture that presently exists, not some sort of sentimentalized culture that we've had in the past and need to return to, or not an aspirational utopian culture of a sort that I think sort of left-wing types of people often kind of imagine. But learning to find satisfaction and appreciation in the culture that currently exists, be grateful for what that represents as a form of inheritance, and derive more of our sort of collective identity around that.
Now, do you think, maybe to kind of inverse the question, because one of the larger challenges to this sort of like appreciation of maybe uncharitably it would be called like the McDonaldization of the world, but Americanization, and kind of just you can go anywhere in the world and you'll see certain kind of American commodities or images emerge. In the same way that I asked, could you create a sort of viable nationalism that's more grounded in the present or future rather than the past? The sort of critique of this sort of Americanization and culturalism would be kind of this anti-nationalism, where a lot of people would argue that you can't necessarily rest a lot of these, or you can't necessarily detach a lot of these kind of present lifestyles, images, ways of life that you would argue aren't sentimental because they're in the present. you can't actually take them from this purely kind of objective present space. A lot of them are kind of grounded in the past and historical events. I mean, American kind of influence in a lot of different countries, like especially if you look at like Latin America, where they might have used potentially more violent anti-democratic means to kind of exert their influence on countries that were attempting to create some level of autonomy. Do you think that there could be a way to advocate for this while addressing the kind of more dark side of the Americanization?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? And I mean, and you know, talking about journalism and that, we kind of live in a golden age in which the dark side of everything is constantly being exposed. So, like a good example would be, say, bananas and pineapples are very present in American culture. They're an important part of, you know, our kind of cultural life. We eat pineapple on the pizzas. Actually, that's a Canadian invention specifically.
Yep, yeah.
And you know, we have banana splits and, you know, banana flavored ear medicine and all just sorts of things like that, right? Like, these are things that are part of our culture, but you're right, like those things specifically only exist because of a fairly brutal history of colonization and exploitation of the developing world. And this is the kind of thing that, you know, people at websites like Vox or Slate or places like that will write very informative and important essays in which they'll say, like, you know, the dark side of your banana split. Did you know that this is rooted in, you know, colonialism and, you know, anti-democratic militia support by the CIA or whatever, right? And that's true. Like, that is problematic, and that is a sort of like legitimate sort of challenge to the kind of thing that I'm advocating, because even then, when you're trying to promote an affirmative sense of cultural identity based on things that we might think of as being more innocuous, like we might think a banana split as an American symbol is more innocuous than George Washington, you know, slave-holding politician, right? But even then, right, like if you try hard enough, you can find reasons to not like even the affirmation of innocuous things, because everything is a product of the sort of the historical cultural context in which it emerged. So again, like, this just seems to be another sort of mark in the case against affirmative patriotism, right? Like that it's difficult to affirm the inherent worth of things.
Yes, and I mean that could probably go to just like maybe a larger discussion of like just meaning and relativism, and how that's I mean, it's fairly popular nowadays, and that just makes it difficult to make any sort of specific normative claims, because you then have to address the 1,000 kind of claims against it, just when you're talking about anything in sociology, philosophy. But I do think that there's maybe some use to like a less extreme degree of keeping those things like in mind, and they wouldn't have to be an extreme, but like Sklar's kind of idea of like the liberalism of fear, I've always found kind of interesting as a way to kind of conceive of building like a society where we tend to try to think of like when we're building some sort of political system and institutions, we want to create this kind of utopian sort of everybody's voices are heard, everything is running perfectly. She believed that we should, instead of thinking what should be like good for everybody, we should kind of build the system around what could potentially go wrong. So no matter what, like instead of any utopian concerns, it's kind of like what sort of evils could we stop the state from doing? So it's a very kind of skeptical philosophy when it comes to forming institutions. It's kind of like harkening back to like Weber's idea of like basically seeing state power as this almost apocalyptic power, and so we need to be extremely cognizant of like who's at the wheel, and speaking culturally, how are these institutions represented culturally. So if we're like talking on like a global scale, this kind of what you were saying, kind of American culture being kind of affirmed and celebrated, she would kind of, I think, be very skeptical and want to explore like, well, what do these images represent, not only for Americans and not only for like Western kind of classes, but also just the world in general, that there could be very like potentially nefarious historical I don't know, stigmas or potential future issues with promoting those images. And I think that we could have that discussion without completely like going like, oh well, we can't have any images whatsoever, because you're right. Like if you keep analyzing everything, you'll eventually see like the kind of rotten side of it. But I mean, it's difficult because, and this is kind of what I wanted to talk about, was like, is it kind of an over reliance on nationalism as forming one's identity that's kind of at the root of this? Like, is this a problem that actually requires a solution, or should we kind of take a step back and think about nationalism and whether it's a good thing to retain, or if we even have a choice in retaining it? Is it always around whether it's good or bad?
Yeah, no, I mean, and there certainly like is starting to be some commentary on that. Like I read a good book recently. It was called After Nationalism, and it was sort of chronicling the different phases that sort of American identity has gone through. You know, like there was a phase obviously where nationalism was sort of conceptualized in a very ethnic sort of way, and then there was a kind of sense in which it was conceptualized in a more kind of like civic nationalist kind of way, like defined by the Constitution and the founding documents and sort of things like that, democracy. And then sort of the conclusion that the author reached was that basically we're now kind of like, we've gone so far now, we're in a kind of phase where we're in something completely new. It's like the whole concept of the country, the whole concept of the national identity is now defined, you know, by the diversity of it. Like by not just diversity in the sense that, you know, there's people of different races or whatever, but like diversity in the sense that there's just different ways of thinking about everything, and that the society is in a constant state of debate and contestation of every sort of foundational pillar of that society. And that we, I think, up until now, have seen that as a kind of deviation from a sort of proper standard of how a society should be. But maybe that is just what the new model of a society is. Like maybe you have a society in which you can no longer have these kind of like big tentpole capital
That's what it is to be an empire.
Everybody has to rally around. And this, you know, it frightens some people because this sounds like a kind of dystopian, postmodern kind of miasma in which just no one gets along with anyone and everything is just this constant fracas of, you know, disagreement in that. But I don't know, like maybe that is the future. Like maybe that's what human civilization will just be defined by, and we'll look back at sort of our fear of it as sort of seeming hopelessly naive, and we'll realize that this actually is just kind of like the end point of where man and his civilization winds up, is something that it is free and liberal, but is also, I don't know, like kind of low level chaotic, or at least kind of low level unstable in a way. And it's yeah, again, like it's hard to fully conceptualize just because we're so used to thinking of the nation state as something that has very defined, you know, borders, not only in the literal sense, but like kind of cultural borders and cultural just a kind of clear sense of who's in, who's out, what is part of our cultural canon, what is not part of our cultural canon. And maybe that is outdated. I don't know. That could very well be.
I think this idea that we're going to have some chaotic future where people are just perpetually disagreeing about everything, but like not doing much about it and just living side by side peacefully with their disagreements, that seems pretty utopian to me. Because like I think if there is any kind of like widespread rift in, you know, culturally or policy wise in our society, I think people will try to seize power to enforce it, and you know, you just end up with people taking sides and you know, wielding the state against their enemies. Like I don't see any end to that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. I think it just comes down to what do you mean by like coexistence. I don't think like there's any real. I don't think we're ever gonna have like, you know, America's national divorce or anything like this. That's all fantasy land. You know, people are never gonna in America, you know, start putting down their iPhones to pick up AR-15s to, you know, go fight in the bushes.
Not anytime soon, anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think ever, in the sense of like we can reasonably say like you'd have to be so far in the future that like anything could be on the cards. You know, even in regimes, even in countries that have awful regimes that do horrible shit, like in China and Cuba, most of the time, if the reality is, if people feel like they can put bread on the table and live relatively good lives, human beings are actually willing to sit down and take a bunch of shit, which really isn't a good thing. But it is just. It is the facts on the ground. So I don't think anything like that's going to happen. But I do think that, if we aren't able to find a good solution to this kind of stuff, the kind of polarization you've seen of things that really shouldn't be polarized and the dysfunction that comes as a result, like COVID-19, right? That's a great example where that probably shouldn't have been nearly as polarized as it was. And if it hadn't been, there's probably a lot of lives and that could have been saved. And not just lives that could have been saved, but people who got sick and the economic turmoil and all the stuff, all the sort of bad stuff associated with it probably could have been a lot less if it wasn't so politicized in the first place.
Yeah, I think the main thing that makes me hesitant about what the narrative that they're giving though is that I don't see a time when people are going to look at their political disagreements and just live and let live. I think I don't.
Yeah, it's always a question of. I think it's always a question of how extreme is the disagreement. You'll never have a perfect harmony, but there's upswings and downswings.
Mm-hmm.
We were just talking about earlier, Vietnam, right? So that's an example where it could have been worse, but it could have been a lot better too.
Mm-hmm.
It's always, I think, contextual as to how good can it be, and when we say something is good or bad, that's always going to be contextual to how good can it be in the particular situation that we're in, not just necessarily all situations are devoid of any situation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the defining challenges of certainly of our lifetimes as we sort of think about some of these things, and we think about as our generation, my generation and your generation sort of rise to positions of power, and you sort of think in the different way that our generations have been sort of culturally raised, I think, to just be a lot more critical, or at least less reverential, or even less knowledgeable about a lot of this kind of stuff. That maybe once we're in charge, that's the kind of sort of model of society that you're going to start to see emerge, one that is defined by its inability to come to clear, unifying truths about itself.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the kind of idea of perhaps there's just smaller groups or no groups, that is I think that is a very kind of weird, almost sounding like science fiction-y kind of, or maybe even Mad Max sort of kind of depiction of the future. But there is I think it's in cognitive psychology, and it goes back to also evolutionary psychology, but there's Dunbar's number, which is you can only have up to 150 social connections or contacts in your mind on average. And evolutionary psychologists kind of use this to explain why kind of nations were formed and stuff like that, because because of agriculture, there was larger populations to the point where you don't know everybody in your village. So you need to kind of have a shared sense of symbols and maybe dress, or just how you're presenting yourself. So even if you don't necessarily know somebody, you kind of know that you're on the same page and you're not part of another group. And the argument there is that this is kind of just nationalism is almost this a evolved kind of necessity in evolutionary psychology, at least, which has its own problems. But maybe I don't think it necessarily refutes this idea. Maybe it explains kind of some of the problems we're having in larger countries where they're becoming very divisive, and these shared images and shared fictions, like we were talking about before, are no longer doing that kind of job of social cohesion and social identification. If anything, I feel like a progressive and a Trump supporting person, if they saw each other in the U.S., it probably invites visceral emotions of you're an outsider and not we're both Americans.
Yes,
which is,
yes.
I think that may have not happened as much. And I think especially with social media, divisive journalism, also it's amplifying it. I don't know if that's do you agree with that, or if that's a...
No, I think that there's definitely sort of something to that, absolutely. And so, when you sort of imagine what it would look like if we were to sort of transcend that, it would be that that stuff would still exist, but we were just kind of like at peace with it, right? Like it wouldn't be seen as a failing, it would just be seen as like what we are, right? So it's like you kind of imagine that there's like some sort of society where we're still
Something that really also makes this kind of hypothetical that JJ is giving seem really unfeasible right now is just the degree to which everything is catastrophized into like the worst thing ever. And like, I know that I'm sure we've talked about this before and stuff. It's just preaching to the choir, but it really just goes to show you, it really does. There really is a lot of benefit to having a certain ambivalence, even if it sometimes isn't, even sometimes when it's unfounded, is just the benefits to then be able to potentially solve those problems in the first place. It's it's like the first thing someone will tell you when, or the first thing like someone will tell you when you are trying to like solve a problem that seems really big is to like try to deal with it in a way that does not constantly mentally destroy you, right? Like breaking something up into lots of little tasks that are more achievable, or like in school they teach all sorts of things like a SMART goal, with it's specific, measurable, actionable. I don't remember all other things, but like strategies to shape your mindset to go into a problem are incredibly useful, and you can really learn from that how important it is. What you think about the problem is almost as important, if not more important, than what the problem actually is.
When you were saying the thing about ambivalence, are you talking about like people just not having uncompromising attitudes about how to run things?
Yeah, having some sort of flexibility by nature of thinking that maybe it's okay if things go one way or the other way. Ambivalence is, I guess, really one example. It's not the thing I'm talking about. It's an example of what I'm talking about, which is just having a mindset that is not so like fragile to things not going your way. And I get when I put it that way, it's a little more loaded than what I mean. But like the idea that that if your solution is not implemented, like it's over, we're fucked. That's a really bad thing to have,
right.
because it means
you can't share power with someone if you believe that them winning is unacceptable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a great example of this in the modern context is climate change. There's all these people on the left who think that like any compromise on climate change means that like the planet is gonna like be turned into a molten cinder in 3 years. And there's people and there's a ton of people, especially young people, who think that like, oh, climate change, we've already lost, it's already over. And it's like totally not true. Like not backed by any of the science, just totally not what any of the experts are saying. Not at all true. But it's super pervasive nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
We still have democratic institutions. Probably a lot of people hate them and think they suck and they were badly conceived and badly designed, and that debate is very robust. And you have people in different political factions who can't agree on anything, but we don't view that as a failing. We just kind of view that as how things are. Like, and it's again like sort of what you said, like, and that in retrospect, we just come to look at this as just the natural evolution, in the same way that you go from having a tribal chief to having a king to having an elected head of government, right? Like, these are just sort of steps you kind of progress through as a society. And then that in the same way that economic progress happens in a sort of linear way, and that maybe this is the kind of just the end state, right? Like that, or not even necessarily the end state, that's a little too Francis Fukuyama, but the idea that this is just like the next evolution,
Francis
that you have a
Fukuyama's
society that is diverse, defined by its diversity, defined by its inability to agree on the big questions, and that's fine. That's just what humans are disposed towards, right? Like, and then some ways that the previous ways, the idea that there could ever be some sort of suite of unifying symbols or patriotic identities, that will seem like the naive, dopey idea, just as like the divine right of kings did.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think that this could have any like semblance of unity, though? Because I feel like to say that there might be like we have discomfort with disagreements between groups, that is very nice, but it seems like it's got to the point where I don't necessarily think it hasn't been like this historically, but now it's like we're very aware of the messaging of kind of certain groups that are just extremely intolerant.
Yes.
And, it goes kind of to Karl Popper's kind of paradox of tolerance, where how do we tolerate people that are intolerant if they're just going to kind of subsume everybody that's tolerating them? Like maybe it is kind of necessary to ensure that there's different groups that are kind of at odds, all within kind of a checked system of institutions, to make sure that not one of them kind of entirely takes over.
No, that's important. I think to concede that there does have to be some. I mean, like, now I feel like I'm sort of like I'm a postmodernist, like arguing I like how this is this postmodern vision of society, right? Which is not really my intent. I'm not kind of like saying that this is good or bad. I mean, I think there's obviously a lot of flaws to it. I'm just kind of thinking like maybe there's inevitability to it that we kind of have to be a little bit prepared for. But if that is the case, then I do think it is important that in order for this model of society to function at all, there does have to be like some sort of system in place, democratic institutions, civil rights, and things like that, like something that we agree to play along with, even in sort of the short term, just to ensure that it doesn't become like violent anarchy and things like that. But it is also worth noting that like some of the polarization, some of the contestation, some of like even like the borderline political violence that we see in the modern sort of Western world, or in the North American context specifically, is born from the idea that like society is deviating from some sort of norm of how it should be, right? We have to save our country, we have to protect it. Like that is an affirmative kind of argument to make, right? Like that there is some sort of fixed way that America is supposed to be, and that if America is sort of like losing that, then the country is failing. And those ideas of what quote unquote America is supposed to be are like culturally particular, right? Like they don't tend to be bound up in sort of like more civic sort of theories of democratic disagreement and sort of robust institutions that can sort of handle and moderate argument and dissent and so forth. Like it's much more like America used to be culturally this way and now it's not anymore, and that kind of stuff, right? And I think even sort of like some folks on the left can kind of drift into that sort of rhetoric as well, as much as they would deny that they do. So you would think, if I was making the case for this kind of like postmodern vision of the society, like you would sort of think that if somehow you could get to a point where people just realize that America is never going to be all one way, and that it's never going to be the society of the past, it is going to be a society that is fundamentally defined by its diversity, and that, groups kind of come in and out of power and exert influence in various ways, and that you have like just constant debates over public policy and how things are managed through a long sort of negotiated process with all of the disparate groups. If that kind of understanding of America becomes more universally accepted, you would think on some level that maybe some of the polarization would go down, just because it would be just kind of like a more kind of clear-cut business-like kind of assessment of the nation, right? Like the stakes would be presumably lower, and like that would be upsetting to some, because it would sort of mean that like America in some ways wouldn't be conceptualized as quite such a grand project. But on the other hand, if the project is a little bit less grand, if it is just a little bit more, utilitarian in its kind of scope and ambition, and like all citizens kind of just come to the American project just thinking like, well, what can we do to like, preserve our interests, get by, achieve some degree of social harmony, maybe that lowers the temperature a bit because people aren't being quite as ambitious anymore.
No, that I mean, it makes sense, and it is difficult to kind of talk about this hypothetical situation, and we are also almost at an hour.
Okay.
But I do want to ask kind of one more question, which is kind of, why do you think that we need this grand idea of the nation to begin with? Do you personally think it's useful? You don't have to be objective, and like if it's really just kind of bound up in identity, why do you think some people would be emotional to the idea of this hypothetical becoming a reality?
I mean, I've always sort of considered myself kind of like an anti-nationalist. I've always been pretty critical of nationalism, just in part because I've seen the way that it played out in this country, and it's always seemed like quite unattractive to me as a Canadian. So that's always made me pretty skeptical of it. And I've always liked, America and American civilization. And one of the reasons why I've always liked America and American civilization is that sort of like the way in which the United States has conceptualized itself, certainly within my lifetime, I know this historically hasn't been the case, is it does seem like it's the closest to a society that defines itself with a nationalism that is kind of anti-nationalist, in the sense that it is defined by its diversity, it is defined by its democratic institutions. It does have a sort of grand sweeping narrative, but even that grand sweeping narrative is in some ways kind of utilitarian in scope. It's like America is the best country in the world because it's the most free, right? Not because, like, I don't know, like Turkey or Italy or some other country or Thailand might conceptualize themselves as being the best place in the world because, like, our people are the best, we have been, gifted some divine mandate to be the best civilization ever, and our culture is just inherently better than anyone else's culture. And it's a very sort of like old world conception of nationalism, right? And that kind of stuff has always been a bit grating to me personally, because it just seems dishonest. It just seems phony and kind of ridiculous, like the idea that Polish civilization is the best civilization that's ever existed, or I don't know, Mongolian civilization or whatever, right? Like these.
I think this is also a really good point to look at, because I don't know how familiar you are with sort of these kinds of like more nationalist, ethno-nationalist talking points, but a trend you start to see a lot is that every ethno-nationalist or like cultural nationalist, basically any kind of nationalist, needs to have some point in history where the thing that they're nationalizing for worked. And with the case of and particularly with the cases of like races, that becomes very thorny, and so you get all these inventions of like Hyperborea and Atlantis, and stuff like this, where people are legitimately like, oh no, dude, Slavs are the master race. Why haven't we still never had an empire? We did. It's called Hyperborea. That's the thing, and so and that's why you can see in the Slavic language many words related to space and air. That's because in Hyperborea they had travel through space and air. You get all this sorts of stuff. The thing that I think is really interesting about that is it demonstrates how you can't have these ideas in just a vacuum. They're going to play out in ways that are going to then basically force, really, the adherents to this to sort of start rationalizing things. And I think that's the really danger. I think that's the true game that you have to play with this sort of nationalism, is you need to create a kind of positive nationalism that doesn't logically lead to or start to logically endorse really bad things, and that is a very difficult thing to do, to sort of thread that needle, right? To say, oh, America's awesome, America's great, we love America, but we did do some bad things, okay? Because if you say that, well, then it is, if you constantly berate someone and get someone to believe America's awesome, well, then actually it isn't that much of a stretch to be like, why are they trying to rationalize some of America's bad actions? Like, it's a really hard thing to try and construct this, like, system of thought in a way so that when you put it into the world and it plays out, it doesn't go to bad places.
Right, so I think this is like the modern conception of the nation state. It kind of has its origins in the early 1800s-ish, maybe a little bit in the late 1700s, and it's like the Romantic era, right? And it's all built on these like romantic ideals, and which is not to say that that's some like totally unique era in history, because I think people have had some version of romantic ideals always that they're trying to live up to, but I mean there's a broader problem with having like high-minded romantic ideals, which is I mean there's more than one problem with them, really. Like one is that if you achieve them, they will not live up to your expectations, and you're setting yourself up for disappointment. But let's not even get to that, because that's not happening in the case of nation states. Another one is that you will feel bad about not achieving them. So we already talked about that earlier. And then a third one is that you will be willing to pay a very high price for them. And so this last one, I think, is why people are just constantly trying to rationalize away the crimes of their nation or whatever. It's like they think like this is a price worth paying for an ideal so grand, or something like that, right? And I think you can see people doing this even with like you know, like if somebody has a romantic relationship in their personal life that they idealize super highly, or like a crush on somebody that's like unattainable, and then they'll be like willing to like go to great lengths for it, and it can end up being really damaging to their life, the amount of like attention and time that they devote and the sacrifices that they're willing to make for it.
Yeah.
These things just seem so obviously particular. They're just like rationalizations of people that happen to have been born in one part of the world and have to sort of come up with a theory of their own greatness. Mm-hmm. Whereas the American system in general, or in theory at least, it sort of like nods towards a kind of universalist aspiration of man, you know, that is then embodied by things like, you know, the immigration system and the Statue of Liberty and all this kind of thing. Like this idea that America can be a democratic, inclusive, diverse civilization that allows every individual to achieve their highest aspiration, which is the pursuit of
that just means we
liberty
conceive of ourselves as
happiness,
an
right?
international empire, and we're certainly not the
and
first
I think
to do that.
that American kind of creed has been inspirational to a lot of people over the centuries that have had problems with old world nationalism, and I guess I'm among them. So, but, you know, that being said, like, this even does sort of carry with it like a kind of implication that there is a certain base level of pride and patriotism that you expect Americans to have to even keep that system going. Mm-hmm. So it is, these are difficult sort of conversations to have intellectually, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it carries with it a lot of historical baggage, and you have to, any sweeping claims have to come with a lot of caution, and it is, but I mean, I would agree with you that, I mean, in terms of like nationalism, it did at least at one point have a more intellectually honest form of nationalism than other countries. It was maybe a bit less grounded in emotion, and maybe more about, you know, liberty and some level of diversity, and it may have, or, you know, not to speak in the past tense, I mean, it's still a nation.
Yes.
But to just the state that it's in now, maybe it's, you know, just some institutions have failed to maintain these symbols, and we're seeing them collapse. They weren't inherently bad, but they just haven't really continued to stick around, and a lot of people are starting to see the American dreams maybe in a more pessimistic tone.
Yes.
But I mean, that's quite a long discussion. If you have anything else to say other than that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I mean, it's as America continues to become more diverse, and as these sort of realities become more inescapable of American diversity, both sort of intellectually and like racially and culturally diverse. The sort of the troubling thing is that you do sort of see this kind of like reactionary kind of like right-wing cohort who are trying to kind of like revive a certain sort of like ethno-nationalism. Mm-hmm. And I do think it is like, that is a very worrying development, and the degree to which sort of like Republican politicians choose to enable that or play along with that, because that just means that the transition is going to be that much more painful. Mm-hmm. Because it seems very obvious to me that, like, you know, America's never going to like reconstitute itself in like a 19th century ethno-nationalist kind of sense, right? Like Tucker Carlson could be elected president, and that's still not going to happen. It's just not a realistic goal given the facts on the ground at this point, mm-hmm. right? And then so you kind of say, like, and I think this is often the case when it comes to political realities, it's like either something is very evident and you can have like a good faith discussion on how you manage the transition into something new, or you can just kind of like stomp your feet and be in denial and throw a temper tantrum and insist that, you know, the sky is red when the sky is blue, right? And so I do think that that is one of the big challenges. You know, as somebody who has like historically kind of identified with the conservative end of the political spectrum, I do think that this is one of the defining challenges for kind of like sensible center-right politics in general, is how can you come up with a theory of conservatism and the politics of, you know, the center-right that is relevant in an era where sort of like one of the great traditional motives of kind of right-wing politics, which is a sort of sense of nationalism and patriotism, is being contested like never before. Can you contribute to that discussion without just being obstinate and frustrated and reactionary? And I don't know if we've seen much evidence that the right is capable.
Well, that was a very postmodern, anti-conservative way to end, but that's anyway, thank you for coming on the podcast. You can check out JJ McCullough's column and also his YouTube videos. They're very entertaining, very educational. Yeah, thanks
so much for having me.
One more thing that I wanted to comment on that they were talking about towards the end there was that the thing about American nationalism kind of being conceived in more of a human universalist way. So just to make the point that this is not actually some historically unprecedented thing, I'm going to compare the United States to like the early Islamic caliphates, right? So those are like in one sense they're like rooted in the culture of like early medieval Arabia, right? And that culture was widely influential within the state, and I think like that's a lot of the way that people think back on that historically. It was the empire of that time and place, but the ideals that they had about themselves were very like human universalists. They believed that Islam was the universal creed for all of humanity, and the state was just a vehicle to serve to serve that end and to spread Islam around the world and to rule in accord with it, right? And I think the United States is almost like that, but for liberalism, for like enlightenment liberalism.
The religion of liberalism.
Kind of. I'm definitely making an analogy between the two.
Sign me up.
It's like in both cases they have this kind of like universalist transnational ideal of what the state is supposed to represent, and they go around like using their power and influence around the world to try to like rule in accord with that, right? So so it's not really a new unique thing in human history for a state to conceive of itself as the vehicle for some like universal philosophical outlook. I don't know. And there's
I don't think you're that far off. I think most of the stuff is just downstream of the very fortuitous feature of human psychology, which is that like if you spend a lot of time around people, it becomes pretty hard to like viciously hate them. So as people tend to become more integrated across the world, there tends to be more and more sort of progression in that direction. Something that's always.
I think I want to contest that, because if you think about what the Balkans are like, with people just living side by side and hating each other for thousands of years.
You can definitely do one step forward, two steps back, but I still think generally like one of the best pieces of evidence, or one of the best pieces of science we have on countering bigotry is that if you grow up in these diverse environments, I'm always reminded if you grow up in these diverse environments, you tend to be a lot less bigoted. I'm always reminded of Mark Twain, how he was very ahead of his times for his depictions of black people in his books, because he grew up around black people and was not at all the massive racist towards them that many others were at his times. But then his depictions of Native Americans, I mean, it is just the most racist shit you could imagine. And Mark Twain, I believe, actually grew up in a town where the only natives that were around, the only Native Americans he ever saw, were criminals that had been deported to a local prison or something. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I remember looking at the research on this at some point, and I don't remember it super well because this was like a few years back, but like I remember like the thing about growing up in a diverse community and that can make you less racist is like conditionally true. It's like basically that like if you grow up around some other ethnic group that's not your own, like in some ways you might be more likely to be super friendly to them, but also the people who are most hostile to a certain ethnic group are people who are adjacent to them as well. So whereas like if you don't grow up around them, you probably just don't actually care that much about them one way or the other. So so it's not just mere proximity.
Yeah, that makes sense. I buy that.
Sorry, I interrupted. You were going to say
no,
something.
I was just going to say, that's always the sort of contemporary example I always go back to. And it's funny, throughout American history, there's particularly the history related to slavery and black people. There's all these, basically bullshit excuses that like Confederates and other slaveholders made up in order to try and justify slavery, when on the face of it, it was very obviously wrong. There's all this stuff about, well, it's not good, but what are you going to do? What are we going to do with all these black people that are now here? Right. That was a huge. That was part of the reason there was such a huge movement for resettling slaves back in Africa, is because people just couldn't conceive of the idea of black people and white people integrating into society. In the South in particular, there was this huge belief that, if you start getting rid of slavery, there's going to be a huge race war. There's going to be a giant slave revolt and race war that's going to happen.
At the time, like they were. Slavery was the kind of the historical norm, right? Like they hadn't yet seen the world without it. So it's easy to kind of not to forgive them for doing slavery necessarily, but to forgive them for at least being skeptical that it could be abolished in a feasible.
Well, yeah, and especially as the slave population exploded with the cotton gin. I mean, there was such a huge shift in the way that slavery operated in America before the cotton gin, after the cotton gin, that for a lot of people it was like, well, there's no going back from this, because there were so many slaves now in a way that there wasn't previously. I think it's almost like a quarter of the population of the Confederacy were enslaved African Americans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And still like a third of the South today or something like that is their descendants.
Yeah, I think it's something like that. Anyways, yeah.
Do you have anything else you wanted to say on the nationalism or nationalistic ideals or the U.S. and Canada relationship or any of that?
No, I mean I think we basically went over it all. Folks, try to get a healthy balance. It's okay to take some pride and to gain some value out of feeling some affinity with your country, but that's perfectly compatible with also acknowledging that it's not perfect and there's a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah, based. I thought this was a pretty good podcast. I enjoyed covering it. Do you want to shout yourself out before we're done?
Yeah, twitch.tv/Flowtrace, twitter.com/Flowtrace. I'm here Wednesdays, and yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna sign off now. So see you around next time. Thanks for joining us.
See ya.